You were scrolling down memory lane when you accidentally tapped your ex's post from years ago. Better delete the whole app. When scrolling's a bust, tacos are a must. Paso, the old El Paso.
Pick up an old El Paso standard stuffed taco kit today.
When modern life gets rough, grab the timeless taste you love. Paso, the old El Paso.
Heather is a nurse practitioner from United Healthcare.
We meet patients wherever they live.
During a house call, she found Jack had an issue.
Jack's blood pressure was dangerously high.
It was 217 over 110.
So they got Jack to the hospital and got him the help he needed.
He had had a stent placed in his heart, preventing a massive heart attack.
If it wasn't for my guardian angel, I wouldn't be here.
Hear more stories like Jack's at UnitedHealthcare.com. Benefits, features, and/or devices vary by plan, area, limitation, and exclusions apply.
Hey, I'm Frank, and I have hidradenitis suppurativa, HS. Before starting Cosentyx, I was so uncomfortable with my symptoms, like not being able to sleep on white sheets or wear white clothes. Now I can appreciate the little things.
Cosentyx secukinumab is prescribed for adults with moderate to severe hidradenitis suppurativa, HS. Don't use if allergic to Cosentyx. Get checked for TB before starting. Increased risk of infections and lowered ability to fight them may occur, like TB or other serious bacterial, fungal, or viral infections. Some were fatal. Tell your doctor if you have an infection or symptoms like fevers, sweats, chills, muscle aches, or cough, had a vaccine or plan to, or if IBD symptoms develop or worsen. Serious allergic reactions and severe eczema-like skin reactions may occur. Learn more at 1-844-COSENTYX or Cosentyx.com.
You're stronger than HS. Ask your dermatologist about Cosentyx.
Welcome to the New Books Network.
I'm Chris Holmes, and this is Burned by Books. Here you'll find interviews with writers you already love, like Jennifer Egan and Rebecca Mackay, mixed in with up-and-coming voices like Alexandra Kleeman and Rumaan Alam. You'll find us wherever you listen to podcasts, but check out previous episodes at burnedbybooks.com and on Instagram and Twitter at burnedbybooks. Let's start the show. Over 40,000 people die to gun violence in the U.S. every year. This is 10,000 more per year than just a decade ago. Diving into the details of all this unnecessary death produces even grimmer statistics. Firearms continue to be the leading cause of death among children in the U.S. There were 656 mass shooting incidents in 2023. Add to this our near monopoly on female homicide, with 70% of all femicides in high-income countries occurring in the U.S. This level of preventable death by suicide, homicide, and accident is a standard unmatched by any wealthy democracy. Enter the AR-15, an innovation in military ground warfare, a gun that is lighter and less error-prone than all of its predecessors, with the capacity to fire small-bore bullets that move with such speed and devastating lethality that even a lightly trained soldier can use the rifle to overwhelming effect. Reporters for the Wall Street Journal, Cameron McWhirter and Zusha Elinson, begin their historical account, American Gun, the true story of the AR-15, with the question of how this gun came into existence. Following the life of the inventor, Eugene Stoner, McWhirter and Elinson tell the story of how one man's invention overcame the bureaucracy and red tape of the military to transform American combat. That history, which is told with a novelist's skill with character arc and intrigue, is then intertwined with the twinned existence of the AR-15 in American civilian life. American Gun pivots halfway through from its historical focus on the lifespan of one weapon to the consequences, intended and unintended, to allowing the endless reproduction of that gun and normalizing its presence and its inevitable reign of violence in American life. Profiling gun lovers and those whose lives and bodies are torn apart by its omnipresence in our lives, McWhirter and Elinson reveal a history of one gun that continues to unfold as a metaphor and unlikely reality of a country overcome by gun violence. It is a necessary book that will have a lasting impact on our one true American exceptionalism. Cameron McWhirter is a national reporter for the Wall Street Journal based in Atlanta. He has covered mass shootings, violent protests, and natural disasters across the South. He is also the author of Red Summer, The Summer of 1919, and the Awakening of Black America. Previously, he reported for other publications in the U.S., as well as Bosnia, Iraq, and Ethiopia. Zusha Elinson is a national reporter writing about guns and violence for the Wall Street Journal. Based in California, he has also written for the Center for Investigative Reporting in the New York Times Bay Area section. Welcome to the show, Cam and Zusha.
Thank you so much for having us.
I'm so pleased that you're here. I think this is such an important book, and it's a big book, but it's a book that reads very quickly and very intensely. It's the history of a very specific rifle, its invention and its repercussions. But the gun problem in the country is incredibly multifaceted, with millions of firearms moving through society in different ways and with different purposes. What was important to you both about focusing on this single and singular weapon? And maybe, Cam, if you want to start us off.
So thanks again for having us on. I would say the result of focusing on the AR-15 was purely a consequence of our reporting. Zusha is based in the San Francisco area. I'm based in Atlanta. We're both working for the U.S. News section of the Wall Street Journal, and we cover breaking news and politics, etc. But we also cover, unfortunately, a lot of these mass shootings that have been taking place in recent years, and we kept running into the AR-15. We started texting each other and calling each other when there would be a mass shooting, asking if it was an AR-15, and increasingly the answer was yes. And we were intrigued by that, and eventually we were paired to do a story for the Journal, what ended up being a business story about the popularity and the rise in sales of the AR-15. But we found so many interesting aspects to this gun's history, the social history of this gun, from the Cold War to today, and including the inventor and wars and generals and spies and cultists. It just went on. And then all the political battles that have arisen. And then also all the people who've been impacted by this rifle's presence in our society, that we felt it had to be a book.
Zusha, did you feel at all that giving such careful attention and research to the gun was in any way sort of antithetical to your having to cover the violent repercussions of the gun's existence? Or did it feel important to do that historical work because of that very fact?
Yeah, in our reporting, as Cam said, we have covered all the major mass shootings. And in doing so, I've gotten to know many survivors of these mass shootings, followed them over the years, watched them try to recover from their devastating injuries. And as we started to look at the history of the gun that was often used in these mass shootings, it was extremely important for us to know the real history behind it. There are so many myths out there, on both sides of the gun debate about this gun and what it can do and how it originated. So I think one of the most important aims for us was to bust all those myths and once and for all write down the true history of this controversial weapon.
So the first half of the book follows the unlikely rise of Eugene Stoner, the inventor of the AR-15, and its military twin, the M16. His is really a quintessential American story. The inventive genius of a single man takes on the bureaucratic machinery of the military to forever change the way rifles are used in combat. And this doesn't even begin to cover the unlikely life of that gun as part of a civilian arsenal. Would you tell us a little bit about that American story and how Stoner became the central figure for you in the history of that gun and also in the multifaceted lives of the AR-15?
Yeah, as we, dove into the history of this gun, we discovered that the inventor was just an incredible, fascinating, unlikely character in all of this. Eugene Stoner, he was a Marine veteran in the 1950s. He had fought in World War II. He was a guy who thought only about gun designs. Whether he was out to dinner with his family, he'd be drawing gun designs on the tablecloth at the restaurants. His wife would say, "Stop writing on the tablecloths." And he would say, "It's fine, they'll wash it out." It's all he thought of. He thought about guns. His wife once said that, he's a pretty quiet guy, but if you talk to him about guns, he would talk about them all night. Now, Stoner didn't have any formal training in gun design. He had no college education, in fact. But instead of limiting him, that allowed him to try out ideas that no one had ever tried before and really allowed him to revolutionize firearms. We found out more about his character, and he's not what you might think about the guy who's behind this gun and all of its imagery. He's a very gentle guy. He never swore. He never spanked his kids. When he was really upset, he would say, "Boy, that frosts me." He was known to wear a little bow tie and his glasses. He liked to wear a clip-on bow tie because it was the most efficient neckwear that he could find. A tie might get caught in the machinery. A regular bow tie would take too long to put on. And that really spoke to his design sensibilities. He liked things to be as efficient and simple as possible. At the time, rifles were made of heavy wood and steel. The military used an M1 Garand, this big, heavy rifle that was a great triumph in World War II as we, defeated the Nazis. But as time pressed on after that, there was a strong desire in some factions of the military to produce a lightweight gun, a gun of the future. And in his garage in Los Angeles, Stoner began to think, how can I make this lightweight gun of the future? The first thing he did was replace some of the heavy steel components with aluminum. No one had really thought of to do that before. And why was that? Well, aluminum was really just becoming a popular metal. He used it all the time during his day job making airplane parts. And he thought, why can't I make gun parts out of that same metal? He also made an incredibly efficient gas system. It basically uses the energy from each shot fired to reload the weapon and expel the spent casing. And he designed the system in an ingenious and very simple way that replaced a lot of metal parts with light, frictionless gas. And, we were really lucky to be able to read a bunch of his personal papers. We listened to recorded interviews that he had, and we were able to read notes from his wife about his life. The family gave us really unprecedented access to his life, where he talks about, his designs and all that sort of stuff. He got his big break. His wife is always nagging him, "What are you doing all the time designing guns?" But he got his big break in 1954 when he met an oily gun executive at the range. And this guy told him he was starting a little company called Armalite. And this is really where his ideas turn into reality. And a lot of people know the name AR-15. They think they know what the AR stands for. Gun control activists will often say it stands for assault rifle. Gun rights activists will argue back, no, it stands for Armalite rifle. In fact, both of them are wrong. And speaking to Stoner's daughter, she said the AR stands for Armalite Research. And the 15 stands for the 15th creation of this little Hollywood startup where Stoner worked. And the story of how Stoner's creation went from an idea in his garage to the military's weapon that they supplied every soldier is quite a tale. And we can talk about that next.
One of the major historical questions that you pursue in the book is how a weapon that was designed for such devastating lethality ended up having an identical twin that was and is legal to own and use for any manner of private purposes. And I wonder if you'd talk a little bit about how corporate interests and then also the rise of a sort of cultural movement around the gun turned this military weapon into something that is so recognizable as something that a civilian can own. And Cam, do you want to start with that?
So the gun was eventually adopted by the U.S. military, and they renamed it the M16, standing for Model 16, because it was the 16th infantry rifle that they had adopted. And that gun was used in Vietnam. There were lots of problems there, but so the gun was really not liked by veterans. They had a real bad feeling about the gun. Also, we lost the Vietnam War. That also played a role in their feelings toward the rifle. And as Zusha mentioned, it was made with all these sort of new parts. It looked very space age. It didn't look like a traditional hunting rifle. So a lot of traditional hunters didn't want to see this gun either. So Colt, which was the original manufacturer of the AR-15/M16, tried to sell a civilian version of the gun. Now, to be clear, a military version of the rifle has it has a switch in which you can fire semi-automatic, which would mean every time you pull the trigger, one round flies out. So you have to pull the trigger each time you want to fire a round, or you can flip it to automatic. There are other sequences you can have there too, but if you flip to automatic, if you hold the trigger down, all the bullets will simply cycle through, all the bullets in the magazine. In the United States today, under current federal law, it's heavily regulated to own what is considered a machine gun, which would be a gun that would fire have the capacity to fire fully automatic.
So what would be the circumstances under which a civilian could own a fully automatic M16?
I could take it. So it's an interesting history, a little sideline, but kind of we can get back to the AR-15. So in 1934, Congress was worried about bootleggers and gangsters of that era during the Prohibition era using these Tommy guns, fully automatic Tommy guns in their crimes. And they made it very difficult for any civilians to get their hands on it. Basically, you had to register it with the federal government, pay a tax, and go through a pretty onerous background check. Then in 1986, Reagan signed a law that banned the new manufacture of new machine guns. So basically, you have a limited supply of machine guns, and anyone who has them has to jump through a lot of hoops to get them. And what that means is that their value has gone way up because there's a limited number of them. And so they cost anywhere from $40,000 to $60,000 each. And there's no more, you can't get a new one. So that means they're really in the hands of wealthy collectors and not so much in the hands of people who would go around shooting people. Of course, there are, not to get too far into it, but of course there's illegal ways to make machine guns, but legal machine guns are generally in the vaults of wealthy people.
And whereas the AR-15, which the civilian version can only fire semi-automatic, is widely available. And I think it's important to point out that soldiers for generations have been taught by their drill sergeants and others to fire semi-automatic in combat unless things are really going badly. And so most of the soldiers who go into combat fire semi-automatic. And to be clear, the ammunition they're using, the speed at which that the bullets fly out of the weapon, the shape and the design of the weapon are virtually the same.
There's nothing like when you get that part from eBay and it just fits. Yeah, the first time. So you can do less of this and get right back to more of this. At eBay, you'll find all the parts you need, guaranteed to fit, at prices you'll love. Sounds good, doesn't it? eBay, things people love. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply.
It's back to school season and Clorox is donating 2 million disinfecting wipes to classrooms across America. Because back to school means things can get a little bit messy. Just ask second grade teacher Mr. Torres.
Put me and just one Clorox wipe on a team, we can take on crayon smudges, sticky fingerprints on every surface, sneezes on the door handle, juice box explosion by the sink, snack crumbs, and don't even get me started on the bathroom passes.
Clorox Disinfecting Wipes, teacher's #1 wipe.
Think about it. Bathroom passes.
Clean feels good. Based on unit sales data.
And so how does this weapon that is virtually the same end up moving into civilian life? How do the kind of the presence of corporate interests combine with a kind of social pull end up with this being something that's so present in American life?
As I alluded to, the gun after Vietnam, and traditional gun owners did not like this weapon, and efforts to when the gun came out of patent in 1977, some small gun owners started to produce AR-15s for civilian sale, and there was a lot of resistance. We have stories in the book of gun companies, the executives in these small companies going to NRA conventions and giving them the finger and yelling at them. People did not want, traditional gun owners did not like this gun, and veterans did not like this gun. So for many years, the only people who were really attracted to it were extremists or survivalists, some gun collectors. It really wasn't selling very well, frankly. But that started to change in the 1980s, particularly in the late 80s and early 90s, when we started to have a lot of discussion about what to do about what was described at the time as assault weapons. There had been some shootings involving AK-47 style guns, and there was a concern by a lot of law enforcement that we needed to do something to restrain how these guns were getting into the hands of criminals, and they wanted to figure out a way to stop that. And there was a lot of political battling going on. Then there was this assault weapons ban that developed in the early 90s, and Bill Clinton eventually supported it, and there were other Democratic leaders who supported it in Congress, including our current president, Joseph Biden, who was then on the chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee. They pushed this assault weapons ban, which included the AR-15, and in theory, it was to ban these guns from civilian sale. As we point out in the book, that didn't happen. What in fact happened was the gun, first of all, a lot of gun owners took great interest in the fact that the federal government was trying to ban certain guns from them, and especially the AR-15, which was American invented and American made. So a lot of them rushed out to buy versions of the AR-15 just before the ban went into effect. And a lot of these small gun companies that were making AR-15 were worried that this was it. They were out of business. But in fact, they found pretty quickly that if they made slight alterations to meet the letter of the law and to make modifications to some of the cosmetic requirements of the federal legislation, they could be back in business. And very quickly they were. So in fact, sales of AR-15s went up throughout the 10-year ban. And the whole time, there was this notion among gun groups and gun owners that somehow the federal government was denying them this gun, and it took on an allure. And it grew in not only in sales, but also in just sort of this mythic importance for the gun rights movement. And then we get to 2001, when there was 9/11, and I'll have Zusha take over from there.
Yeah, so there were huge political and social transformations that brought this gun from a niche product that was sort of scorned by the gun industry to a blockbuster product that really became the financial savior for the gun industry. The first cultural shift was 9/11. You had, during that time, a great rally around the flag moment. Everyone was supporting our troops going off to the Middle East, most people. And what gun were these new American heroes carrying? They were carrying the M16 and its cousin, the M4. And suddenly that bad taste of that gun from Vietnam was washed out of everyone's mouth. And veterans coming home from those wars wanted to buy the civilian version of that gun. It was familiar to them. Gave them comfort, made them feel safe. And then people who admired veterans, people who wanted to be like soldiers, saw that gun and they wanted to buy one too. So this sort of military stance that the country had at that time really sparked an interest in this military style gun. You know, people wanted to buy Hummers, camo clothing. It really fit into that. And as sales started to increase, another big political thing happened, which was that the assault weapons ban, which had been in place since 1994, lapsed in 2004. The reason it was not renewed is because the political coalition that had pushed it through in 1994 was no longer there. One of the key, what I would say the crucial linchpin for passing the assault weapons ban was support from law enforcement. Police during the 1990s did not like criminals having these types of weapons on the street. They felt outgunned, and they didn't want to be shot at with AKs, ARs, and all that sort of stuff. But by the time that 2004 rolled around, police on the streets had seen that the assault weapons ban was pretty ineffective and hadn't done anything. And they didn't think that it was worth their political capital to support some sort of law that hadn't really done much. And secondly, they decided they would rather expend their political capital in getting money so they could buy themselves AR-15s to protect themselves. So that part of the coalition wasn't there. Another important part of the coalition, suburban women who had supported a lot of gun control, were far more concerned about terrorism at that time. And sort of the whole debate over global terrorism really crushed the gun control debate. And the gun control movement was in disarray. Meanwhile, the gun rights movement was ascendant. It had grown, NRA had grown by millions of members for a variety of reasons. And then, of course, we had a Republican president and a Republican Congress and the Republican-led Congress was not interested in getting this through at all. So the federal assault weapons ban lapsed. And even though it hadn't done much to prevent this small renegade group of gun makers from building AR-15s, it had prevented mainstream publicly traded companies from getting into it just because, for them, they have reputational risk issues and they, publicly traded. So once that was gone, the big gun companies decided, all right, we're getting into this fast growing market. And we spoke to a lot of gun executives. We were able to look at internal presentations from the time, and they were just all really eager to get into this market because the AR-15 was the fastest growing segment in the gun market. Around this turn of the century, companies were really struggling. They were getting hit by a lot of lawsuits. There's a real decline in hunting. There was a decline in demand for handguns because crime was declining. So they saw in the AR-15 a product that they felt they could make a lot of money in. And that's not just a cliche. The gun was actually wildly profitable because of the way it was designed. Stoner had designed it to be easy to put together, take apart, manufacture, and cheap to manufacture, in fact. And so,
and it's easy to fire, right? It doesn't have a big kickback, and it's someone who's not even particularly strong could operate it.
Oh yeah, absolutely. So yeah, let's talk about the appeal of this gun. So we talked a little about why gun industry was interested in building and selling them. The gun, once people got it in their hands, for whatever reason they bought it, they realized that it was very easy to shoot. They had very little recoil. You could squeeze off a lot of shots very quickly. One thing, when you have a semi-automatic weapon, right, if you're able to keep on target and then, the gun doesn't go flying up into the air because of the recoil, you can shoot follow-up shots much more quickly. And that's the case with this AR-15. You can really shoot follow-up shots very quickly. And the reason it's so easy to shoot is because of the way Stoner designed it and because the bullet, the .223 bullet, is a very tiny bullet. And so it's just not that much recoil. What did people do with this gun once they bought it? They did early surveys of AR-15 owners. Most of them used it for target shooting. It was not a great hunting gun because it's not great for hunting large game. eventually they made it so you could modify it and you could use it for large game hunting. But the original version with the 223 bullet, people were using it for target shooting. People kept it in their homes because they felt it would be good to defend their home with. It was not largely used for hunting. Another thing that people really loved about it was that they felt they could tinker with it. So, a lot of guys on the weekends, they like to play with their muscle cars. They like to fix their motorcycles. This gun, unlike any other gun that came before it, you could modify it. You could switch out parts, switch out the stock, switch out the pistol grip, modify it however you wanted it. So it came to be known as Legos for adults or Barbies for men because of that, or kind of an erector set for men, they called it. So that's what really appealed to people. And then certainly politics just juiced this market. So in 2008, Barack Obama was running for president, although he was extremely moderate on guns because he's a pretty savvy politician and realized he wouldn't win him a lot of votes in the sort of swing states. The NRA launched this all-out multi-million-dollar ad blitz saying he was going to take everyone's guns. And AR-15 sales just went bonkers in that election year. Mm-hmm. And AR makers realized that this gun, more than any other gun, really was sensitive to the fears of the American public. And if there was a Democratic presidential candidate calling for assault weapons bans, or if there was a shooting followed by such calls, sales would go through the roof. If there was, some major panic, like even Y2K, if you remember that one around the turn of the century, people ran out to buy this type of gun. So it's a really cyclical, the sales of this gun are really cyclical and really tied to current events.
And it's now tied very firmly politically to a movement, to the MAGA movement. It was present in all kinds of ways that you show in the book, in the January 6th insurrection. And so to my mind, this is a very dangerous turn in the gun's life. When you start to have a political party associated with a gun that is paramilitary, let's say, and designed for lethality, you start to hearken back to 20th century fascism and the ability to draw on kind of mobs of armed people. Does it feel to the two of you that the gun's history is now making a sudden turn towards something darker that has historical precedence?
Well, I wouldn't maybe I wouldn't be as gloomy as you painted it, but I would say that there are, I think there's, with this massive increase in sales of the AR-15, we've gone from, few 100,000 in civilian hands prior to the assault weapons ban. Today, there's well over 20 million. We don't know how many million, but well over 20 million. And so the gun, lots of these gun owners are responsible people who are not out to hurt anyone, and they keep their gun in a gun safe and teach gun safety to people and practice it themselves. So they're not but that's not the problem. The problem is as you pointed out, there are people who are drawn to this gun as a symbol, as a totem almost, of gun rights and defiance of federal authority, and or whatever other view they care to have. A lot of the mass shootings that have taken place in recent years have been by people who were very disturbed and had mostly personal reasons. But there's also people who were self-declared Islamic terrorists. There were people who are white extremists, supremacists. I mean, we've had a range of people drawn to this gun and embrace,
like David Koresh, as you point out in early.
Right. But this gun has become a symbol to them. There is a phrase in ancient Greece, molalabe, which means roughly "come and take it." And there was a battle in which the Spartans were facing an overwhelmingly large Persian army, and the king was told, "Drop your weapons," and his response was, "Come and take it." And this has become a battle cry for the gun rights movement. You will see it on bumper stickers with a silhouette of the AR-15. It's a surreal merging of historical events where you'll have a silhouette of an AR-15 rifle and then the Greek phrase that was supposedly said, according to one historical account, by King Leonidas of Sparta, basically saying, "Come and take it." And as you pointed out, on January 6th, there were flags being waved, a Confederate battle flag with the silhouette of the AR-15 and the phrase "Come and take it." Another flag with the silhouette alone saying "Come and take it." We've had extremists practicing with AR-15s who were planning to shoot up, surprisingly, a gun rally that was going to be held that was held in Richmond, Virginia. The federal authorities intervened and caught those people, but
a gun rally.
They wanted to.
The irony.
There are elements out there that believe that are drawn to this weapon in part because they see it as a tool to sow disorder, and there have been, extreme groups showing up at various rallies that we've, and protests that have been held in recent years with these guns, and it has really become for them, to point out on January 6th, there was the symbolism of those flags, but there were also the Proud Boys they had stockpiled AR-15s at a motel not far from, just over the Potomac.
For part two, which thankfully we didn't see.
They were asking, asking their quote commanders unquote, to come if they can come in. So we were very close to serious violence. And the design elements of this gun developed by Eugene Stoner for the U.S. military to help our soldiers and our allies fight communist insurgents primarily, it achieved all those design goals, and it is a very impressive creation when you really start to understand it. But now the way this gun is being used is a way that would make Eugene Stoner he would be gobsmacked by where we are today. And I think to me, that was one of the more interesting parts of researching and writing this book, was that we have a device that was really like we've been saying, this guy was an American hero / inventor in the classic style of Alexander Graham Bell or Steve Jobs or some sort of weird combination of those two. I mean, he's off in his garage tinkering away because he wants to have an impact on the world and he thinks this would help, and here we are. Once you create something, once you invent something, it's a Pandora's box, and that it completely leaves the inventor very quickly. Eugene Stoner, as we document in the book, lost control of the gun very quickly after its creation, a few years after its creation, and it takes on a life of its own. And how it's going to impact our culture and our society, he could never have predicted.
That gets me to part two of the book, in which you go broad, looking at mass shootings in particular and tragic events of violence that are connected to the AR-15's prevalence in American life. Zusha, would you talk a little bit about how the two of you decided to organize the second half of American Gun around largely the violent repercussions of the AR-15?
Certainly. I mean, there's a number of reasons. One is because, this is sort of the tragic ending of the story. It begins, as Cam said, very hopefully with the guy pursuing the American dream in his garage, and it ends with, people innocents getting shot at concerts and schoolyards. The other reason we wanted to highlight those stories was because we covered a lot of them, and we felt that the stories of the people who survived these mass shootings was really getting lost. You cover a mass shooting and the TV cameras come in, president comes in, everyone sends their well wishes and their donations, and then a couple days later, it's all gone. So one thing we were really interested in is following these people. What were their lives like after? What was the impact on their lives? What did they do? How did they cope? How did they overcome? How did they survive? And some of them are very heartbreaking but inspiring stories. For instance, in Sandy Hook, we follow a family that lost their beloved 6-year-old son, Ben Wheeler. The parents are artists, and they are moved to become political activists after the Sandy Hook mass shooting. And they go to the state and they ask for changes, and they are amazed when the state changes a bunch of gun laws. Then they go to Washington, D.C., and they lobby the Senate and the Congress people for more changes. And our story follows them into those meetings in the Senate building and what that was like for them, and how the senators responded ultimately by telling them no, they couldn't do anything. There's this really striking scene that David Wheeler, Ben's father, told me about. He was sitting in a meeting with Iowa Senator Chuck Grassley, a Republican, and they were showing him pictures of Ben and telling the senator stories about their children. And Grassley was looking down at the ground. He couldn't look them in the eye, and he was crying. He was telling him he had grandkids. And then when they asked him, can you vote for this bill we're supporting for universal background checks, Grassley told him no. He couldn't do it. They said, why? And he said, well, the calls are coming into my office saying my constituents in Iowa don't want it. And
he says you wouldn't understand, right? Isn't that
right? And they just keep pleading with him. They say, well, why? Can't you just use your position of power? And he finally says, you wouldn't understand. And this just made David Wheeler so angry. We have this quote in the book where he says, who is it that's not understanding?
Yeah. That moment was a jaw dropper in the book, and I'd not heard that story before. I'd heard the stories of the Sandy Hook families petitioning and talking to every possible person they could and finally being rebuffed, but I'd never heard that one, and it infuriated me. And the total lack of understanding, or perhaps understanding all too well, but being too cowardly. I mean, if your position is about protecting and thinking of the best possible outcomes for your constituents, and at the end of the day, you won't do it because you're afraid of losing your job or losing power, then the system is it's quite broken, I think.
Certainly, that was one of the things we really wanted to explore in this book. So after 1994, when the federal assault weapons ban passed, the NRA went on a real campaign of retribution, and a lot of Democrats, moderate Democrats, and even some extremely conservative Democrats at that time, very rural, who had voted for it, were targeted. And that they took the House from the Democrats in 94 in the midterms. Republicans were in control for the first time in 40 years. And that was in large part because of this assault weapons ban. And ever since then, politicians were sort of looking over their shoulder, worried that if they voted for gun control on the federal level we're talking about, that they too would lose their seat. And they were very afraid because gun owners are very dedicated single-issue voter bloc. It's something that the liberals do not have. There's not a voting bloc, at least at the time, dedicated to gun control. It's changing a little, and we can talk about that in a second, but certainly around the time of Sandy Hook, gun owners were a far more potent force in the political spectrum. A lot of people like to talk about how the NRA is, if you're on the liberal side, they say NRA is this big bad lobbying machine. They're the reason that nothing can get passed through Congress. But it's really because people in Congress worry about keeping their seats. And there are polls that show that conservatives are much more likely to pay attention to their position of their representatives on guns than liberals are. Liberals have a much broader menu of policy options that they're looking at, and guns is pretty far down on the list. Certainly, there's a great swell of support for gun control after mass shootings, but after that, it kind of dissipates. And in the book, we really try to profile some of these gun owners who were really dedicated to the cause and try to really explore why they were so upset. And in speaking to them, these are guys like Chris Waltz in our book who they own guns, they keep them in safes, they train their kids on how to shoot guns, and they do it very responsibly. They never commit a crime. And they feel like they should not be punished for some insane psycho going and shooting a bunch of school children. As Chris Waltz told Cam, who interviewed him, he said, if all AR-15 owners were psychos, you'd all be dead. There's 25 million AR-15s out in the country right now. So it was important for us to explore that very strong gun rights movement to help explain sort of the political outcome on the federal level.
This podcast is brought to you by Carvana. Got a car to sell but no time to waste? Hop on to Carvana.com to get a real offer for your car in seconds. All you have to do is enter your license plate, answer a few quick questions, and if you accept the offer, Carvana will pay you as soon as you hand the keys over. They even offer same-day pickup in many cities. Save your time, score some cash, and sell your car the convenient way to Carvana. Pickup times vary. Fees may apply.
Tired of losing your sanity looking for important work? Dropbox Dash finds what you need fast across all your work apps so you can focus on what matters. Dash means less time searching, more time creating. Learn more at dropbox.com/dash.
Yeah, there's this interesting parallel that develops, and in some ways opposition, and in other ways an interesting way of tracking the continual history between someone like Chris Waltz and then Valerie Callis Weber, who was a victim of the gun when she was shot at a mass shooting incident. Cam, do you want to talk a little bit about how that kind of parallelism in the book works for you and what it was like to interview Chris Waltz, but then also Valerie Callis Weber?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important. One point I'd like to add is it's important to note also we have, in many issues in our country, we have these older leaders who've been around for a long time. And their ideas focus on what solutions they thought worked in the past. So on the Republican side and on the NRA side, we had Wayne LaPierre, who was really pushing for more guns everywhere, including the AR-15. And then on the other side, you had people like Joseph Biden, President Biden, who constantly talk about an assault weapons ban. And new ideas need to be brought to the fore, and they need to be agnostic, not Republican, not Democrat, not conservative, not liberal, ideas that work. And I think that's where, toward the end of the book, we start to talk about that. But Chris Waltz is someone who was ardently for the AR-15 and had trained on the M16 and trained others on the M16 in the Army. And when he retired, he went into contracting, defense contracting, then he kept the AR-15 and would shoot regularly. And after Sandy Hook, he was horrified by what had happened, but he was more terrified and angry that there was discussion of another assault weapons ban. And that led him angrily in his pajamas one night at his kitchen table to start a Facebook page just to sort of vent on this issue. And very quickly that he was suddenly had tens of thousands of hundreds of thousands of followers. And he actually started a business in which he would sell initially AR-15 parts and decals and things like that. And then pretty soon he was selling full AR-15s. And it's been a business ever since Sandy Hook. And it's been a very profitable one for him, because there was such a groundswell of animosity toward any attempt to rein in this gun. And he's sort of a quintessential American AR-15 advocate, maybe the quintessential AR-15 advocate. And there are many others, and they feel very firmly that this gun, because of its lethality that you pointed out and its rapid fire, make it a modern musket. He has a flag in his office of the 3 percenters. It's an American, American flag. I don't know if you've heard of the 3%.
Sure, yeah.
I had not when I saw the
Sadly, I have.
What is that? I don't know what is it. But that, that's this notion that it was really 3% of the colonists who actually led to the American Revolution and actually fought in the American Revolution. This notion that it takes a vanguard of sort of super patriots to preserve a real America, and whatever that means. And they embrace this gun as the modern musket to do that. They will be Minutemen, and they will, they can't use a hunting rifle to fight the government, but they can use an AR-15, which obviously has frightening prospects. But then and the thing is, there are people like that. There are people fiercely acting in the gun control movement, and then there are people like Valerie Callis-Weber, who was just an older woman working at a county office building, a county government office in San Bernardino County in California, who's just has to go to a party, sort of a Christmas party / work event that she doesn't want to go to, in 2015, and she goes there, and two Islamic terrorists, one of whom worked in the county government, come in with AR-15s, and one of them shoots her twice and kills a lot of other people and wounds a lot of other people, but she's shot twice. And we cataloged, Zusha met her many times, and cataloged her unbelievable, in my opinion, like incomprehensible efforts at recovery. And she's an amazing
57 surgeries and 3,500 hours of therapy.
She was shot in the shoulder, and she was shot in the pelvis. And those injuries with two bullets, these are very small, tiny rounds relative to other guns. But once they get in the body, because of the high velocity round, when these smaller bullets enter the body, they whirl around like a tornado, and they ping off of bone. They shatter bone. The bullets shatter and shoot splinters everywhere. They cause they cause bones that are trying to repair themselves to have sort of almost become hyperactive and produce extra bones. She has to go through surgery in which they're chipping out pounds of extra bone that is sort of, with the body just sort of wildly trying to repair itself from the trauma it's suffered. And she has all kinds of, she's an amazing person, obviously, and tackles it with great humor. But she also has incredible challenges, psychological and fighting with her insurance companies, fighting with her doctors. It's a tremendous, horrible story that I think ultimately leads to her coming to peace, hopefully, with what had happened to her and coming to terms with it. But she is a person who we wanted to document her story, because this is a person who had no real stake in, she wasn't politically active. She still isn't politically active. And we write about people who die in mass shootings. We would cover those. This so-and-so passed away in this mass shooting. And that has a terrible trauma, of course, for the family members. But what is it like to actually be hit by this gun and actually have to recover from the injuries caused by it? Because people forget about those people, and they really shouldn't, because these mass shootings involving this rifle are causing a ripple effect of trauma across our nation for years, for generations.
Yes, and so there's a now fairly famous Huffington Post article that it's a long interview with a trauma doctor, Amy Goldberg, who I think is at Temple University, a hospital. And she is someone who sees constant gun assault and the damage that it does to bodies. I don't think that's a conversation that we have enough in the country. So splitting apart for a second the idea of someone who's worried about losing their right to defend themselves or overthrow the government, and instead thinking about what's the literal damage that happens to a body when it's shot, and how that damage is different with the AR-15. And what does that mean when we say that that's okay? As opposed to having a a handgun in your house that you use for defense, having something that is designed in a way to just damage so thoroughly the body that it, luckily, in Valerie's case, there is some kind of recovery. But Zusha, did you want to think for a second about like what the damage that bullets do to bodies and why the AR-15 in particular is a gun that is built to do the most possible damage?
Yeah, so I'd love to give your listeners just a little grasp of the overall universe of firearms and kind of the damage they do really quickly. So most murders in this country are carried out with handguns, as we know, because they're the guns that people can easily conceal on themselves. Criminals like them. But frankly, the damage they do is much less in some ways than an AR-15, and that's because the bullet fired from a handgun is much slower and it's rounder in shape. And so when the bullet goes into your body, it travels generally in a straight path and carves it sort of a narrow channel. So certainly if it hits a vital organ, it goes through the brain, it's going to kill someone. But the difference is that the AR-15 bullet, a .223 bullet, is a very small bullet, but it goes very fast, much faster, sometimes 3 times as fast as a handgun bullet. And it was designed this way. So when Stoner designed the AR-15, the general who was very interested in this type of weapon gave him some parameters for the type of bullet it should have. And he said it should be able to pierce a metal helmet at 500 yards, I believe. So they wanted a very light bullet that could do a lot of damage. And so Stoner designed it that way. He had a tiny little bullet, and he put a big casing on the back that had a lot of gunpowder in it, so it went very quickly. And what it does is, it flies nose first through the air, if you can picture that. And then it goes unstable when it hits the body, and it swirls around, like Cam said, like a tornado or like a spinning top. And that's really how it does outsized damage. Certainly, if you were shot by a hunting rifle, those have really large bullets that go pretty fast, and they are also designed to mushroom. That would do incredible damage to a human being. But, as we know, a lot of people aren't shot by hunting rifles. They're usually shot with handguns in most cases, and in a lot of mass shootings, they're shot with AR-15s. And so it just does a great amount of damage. With Valerie, it shattered her pelvis, and it shattered her, sort of pulverized her shoulder. And just to give people sort of a bigger statistical picture of this, mass shootings are a very small percentage of homicides in our country every year, very, very small. But still, AR-15s are used increasingly in those mass shootings. We've seen it go from about 5 out of 120 before 2012 to now, where we're seeing more than half of all mass shootings, the shooters are using AR-15s. And so, people are looking at this gun more closely because of that. And doctors, as you said, are starting to speak out about the injuries they're seeing.
So one of the things I wanted to close us with is you talk with some researchers at Northwestern who point to a couple of policy changes that might reduce the number or lethality of mass shootings. And they point to requiring a permit to own a gun and banning large capacity magazines. But I wonder, in your research for this book, whether you feel like, one, those had any chance politically, and two, whether you see other compromise ways of coming to terms with our real epidemic of gun violence. And, I'm thinking about how other countries have managed to, not with one law, but with a sweeping suite of laws, do what we claim that we can't. And I wonder if you saw something that might bridge the seemingly insurmountable gap between two ways of looking at this, that might do some of that limiting of the violence and death.
Well, I'll jump in to say that toward the end of the book, we do discuss various options that people are exploring, and that it really is going to boil down to trial and error and trying different things. There's no quick answer here. Despite sloganeering on various sides of this issue, That's not, it's going to take a lot of hard work to figure out how we catch up to technology. Technology has brought us to a place that where we don't want a world where we're constantly having these gridlock political battles and where toddlers have to have mass shooter training. This is not what any of us want. So we need to start trying things that could keep people who shouldn't have this gun, keep this gun out of the hands of people who just shouldn't have it. And that's a very tricky, complicated issue. But there are people starting to look at things like raising the age limits for owning a semi-automatic military-style rifle in certain states, red flag laws in which people who have been saying disturbing things to their friends or family or online could have their guns, people could go to court and have their guns temporarily taken away from them. That is obviously a tricky constitutional issue, but it has been tried in states, and increasingly states are looking at that. There's also been a lot of increasing resistance to that as well, but that is one way to try to reduce the chances that someone who wants to go to war with society, for whatever their reasons, their disturbed reasons, is going to gravitate toward this type of rifle and use it in a horrific, quick way. I mean, that's the thing. You can use this gun easily. The kid in Uvalde had never fired a gun before that day. The kids who, people who are using this gun can wreak havoc in literally seconds. You can fire off a lot of rounds. And that, you know this for grocery stores, classrooms, movie theaters, rock concerts, you name it. Anywhere people gather, this could happen, and it's on everyone's mind.
I would just add one more thing, which is something that Cam usually says. He had this kind of revelation as we were studying Eugene Stoner. He's an engineer. He tries all things. He has a real engineering mind to solving problems. He gets obsessed with solving problems. And as Cam says, we need to take that same approach to, mass shootings and gun violence. We need to lay aside our politics and try things that work, no matter where they come from or whose idea they are, whether that means, having more armed guards in places, which was suggested, initially by the very pro-gun side, whether that means trying out red flag laws, which was, proposed by gun control advocates, but ultimately embraced by some gun owners as well. We need to focus on practical solutions, and we also need to focus on what the real problem is. We need to care less about having more people gravitate to whatever side we're on. We need to get rid of the sort of team sport of gun politics and focus on practical solutions.
Before I let you go, I would love to know if there were books that were personally important to you at the time you were writing this, or books that were essential to the research that you think others might be interested in having a look at.
I'll say that this book was written in part because we didn't find a good social history of this gun. There are definitely good technical books about sort of the development of the rifle early on, but there really wasn't. There was nothing telling the story of Eugene Stoner. There were some explorations of the development of the rifle and Vietnam, but not really cohesive. And certainly no one had wanted to tackle the complex social and political history of how this gun became the most popular rifle in America and the most despised simultaneously. And we were foolish enough to tackle that issue. That's why the book was written, because there wasn't a book like that. That being said, I would say as a boy, I read a book called Sideshow by a man named William Shawcross, who was about the secret bombing of Cambodia by Nixon and how that led to the rise of the Khmer Rouge. And I was a young boy, but I felt that book taught me the notion of unintended consequences. As Nixon wanted to stop communist Vietnamese soldiers from coming through Cambodia to get to Vietnam. It was a way to fight the Vietnamese, and instead he led to the rise of the communists, the Khmer Rouge. And so that has always sort of haunted me as an important book. And then I would say Dexter Filkin's book, The Forever War, about fighting, about his reporting in Afghanistan and Iraq and the fighting there and the complex chaos of unintended consequences that he had to swirl around in.
Yeah, so a couple of books that were really helpful in doing research about the history of gun laws and guns in our country. One was reading Gunfight by Professor Adam Winkler. He gives a really good summation of the important legal cases and how gun laws developed in the Old West. I recommend that for anyone seeking to understand gun laws better. Another great book was Misfire by Tim Mack. Really got into how the NRA sort of started to crumble because of self-dealing and greed. Another great book was Horse Soldiers, which was by Doug Stanton, and that catalogs sort of the Green Berets going to Afghanistan. And in fact, we interviewed some people who appeared in that book about how soldiers use this gun in combat. That was important. On a personal level, I would say throughout writing this book, I was reading Robert Caro, the LBJ series. He is the historian and writer I probably admire the most. I love how obsessed he is with his subject, how he seeks to shatter all myths, how he wants to present the unvarnished truth. And those are things we strove to do in this history as well.
Well, I would say American Gun is absolutely an unvarnished truth, and a book that does difficult things, and in particular talking about a subject that is so polarizing, but in a way in which you put to the fore truths, historical truths about a certain kind of gun, and then the consequences. And as Cam says, the unintended consequences of having a technology let loose into the world. And I found it a absolutely gripping read. I've read a lot on gun violence, and I find this book to be different than almost everything else I've read. And I just can't thank you both enough for coming on and talking about it.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thank you so much, Chris, for the really thoughtful discussion.
Well, the pleasure was all mine. Well, that's all from me for now. My thanks to Wall Street Journal reporters Cameron McWhirter and Zusha Elinson for coming on the show to talk about their history of the AR-15, American Gun, a book that is revelatory not only for the unusual history of one weapon, but for the ways in which our society has acceded to allowing that gun to circulate unburdened by regulations through the hands of civilians all over the country. You can find links to purchase American Gun, The True History of the AR-15, and all of Cam's and Zusha's recommended books at the website, burnedbybooks.com. There you'll find all of our previous episodes, links to buy a podcast t-shirt, and ways to get in contact. As you listen, take a moment to rate the show on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you find your podcasts. Until next time, this has been Burned by Books.